Welcome to Just Enough to Get Started in the area of bioinformatics. This second video on R is basically just a first look or a quick run through for R and RStudio, and I'll go over some of the portions of RStudio that are interesting and relevant to working with it later on. So let's get started. So, as we've explained before, we've downloaded R and RStudio and installed it. And we have opened up the program using our menu bar in RStudio, and we've come up with this first page. So on the left-hand side, you have two things, the console and the terminal. The console relates directly to the version of R and running R. So we have version 3.44, that's fine. Another thing that's on the left-hand side is the terminal. The terminal is always there if you need to use it for, let's say, saving things, changing files, gaining information from certain directories, changing directories. That can all be done with the terminal. Another thing that I may talk about in the future is Git. Saving the information with Git as well can be done with this terminal. The second window I'll go to is the environment and history. Although there's nothing in here right now, the environment will basically keep track of the variables that you're running in your data manipulation and the files that it is looking at. So it'll hold that information for you to look at in a sort of environment that you can go back to and double check. The history is the same sort of thing. It actually has the history of the commands that were used over the last, let's say, 100 commands. The connections obviously are connections that are running between instrumentation, running between networks. So that's something that you may not use so much. I generally use the environment and the history a bit to look at what I have done and what the variables are while I'm running them. The bottom portion here, as you can see, are files, plots, packages, help, and viewer. This is a very helpful window down here on the bottom. The files basically allow you to look at your files on your desktop or on your computer, basically. So if you go to your desktop, you might find that there's some certain files that you like there and can use. There are other files. We'll actually be using files from the download folder later on. Here are some files that are listed for us. We have a CSV, other types of files as well. The plots, actually, if you are producing plots for your work, basically, either graphs or box plots or some sort of heat map or something like that, it will be shown here if it's not shown in the console and in the working side of your left window. That's something you can export into PDF or images or save to a clipboard for later use. Packages. Packages are very important. So this basically allows you to look at the packages that are pre-installed or installed with R and RStudio. And by looking at the check marks here, you know that these packages are already ready and good to go. So you have all sorts of packages. You can read about them by touching on them. Here's one called Datasets. We'll look at it. And it comes up with a help sort of menu, the help file, which has a small description. Pressing on that, we have no information found there, but we have all the things that are listed in this dataset file. So in this package, there are different modules, different programs, so to speak, that either have data information attached with them. So this person is actually looking at airline passenger numbers from 1949 to 1960, but also they may have certain calculations that they want to do and have programmed them into this package for later use. So the ability to do covariance work. So there's all sorts of different packages. This one seems to have a lot of data. So if we go back, we can look at all the different packages that we need. The basics package that you'll use on a constant basis is the stats basic package. And here it explains every module that is in it. So if you want to do an ANOVA, there are commands and packages for ANOVA. There are linear regression models. There are analysis of variance for different types of models. There are ARIMA models for time series data. There are also correlation tests. So I suggest that you look at these commands generally don't need to study each one, but it might be a good idea to learn about the different options that you have. So for example, here is a binomial distribution that is very common for statistics and will help you actually do binomial calculations. Another one that I find very interesting and very good to use is the normal distribution. So let me see if I can scroll down and find it. And the normal distribution, as you can expect, or as you would expect, basically gives you information about normal distributions. You can either generate numbers to form a normal distribution with a certain mean, a certain standard deviation. You can do it in log format or not. You can actually do the calculations for probability or p-values given certain normal distributions with some mean, some standard deviation, whether it's a left tail or right tail or both. You can do log p-values. You can do other calculations where you can actually have random numbers generated. So if you wanted to do some calculations to see if your data fits a normal distribution with certain mean and standard deviation, you can then generate numbers to test your hypothesis. So it describes how to use it, just like it did in Linux and the command lines, and also it gives you ideas of the arguments. So the arguments are what are in the parentheses and what you can do and ask. So for example, on this R norm, or random normal values, you can look at vectors and possibilities. You can look at the number of probabilities or observations that you want to produce. You can have 1 million observations produced. You can change the mean to some value, change the standard deviation, and as I explained before, have log values and look at lower and upper tails. It also gives you some of the mathematics behind that and a small description on some of these things. So here are some other articles that you can look up and read if you're interested in finding out more about it that way. So let me go to the top as well. So now that we've looked at the 4 windows on the bottom, and I can move these windows around as you've seen with this top bar when that hand is shown. I can also move these windows around when I have my finger or my cursor on this portion here. I can minimize a window or I can maximize a window. I can basically do all of the same functions that I can do with the GUI. So if I want to now open up a new file, I can then open up scripts, a notebook, which we'll explain and talk about, R Markdown, or other types of R files. I can start a project. I can open a file of data, for example. I can even save data and save files. Another nice function is this import data set. So if you have data sets that you want to import easily and quickly, you can simply set the computer to do that. Edit. It's fairly straightforward. You can copy, cut, and paste into your notebook, into your files. Code. The code here is fairly straightforward. Nothing is listed right now because we have no programs running, but once we do, I'll show you that you can run certain lines or sections of the code and see how they run basically. You have your view. If you need to zoom in on windows, zoom out, switch tabs, switch focus to different sources. So there are keyboard shortcuts for a lot of the work that's done with your cursor. So for example, if my cursor is on this window here and want to move it to the first window, I can use, as they say here, Control 1 to go to source, Control 2 to go to console. So let's try that. Our cursor is here and we'll go to Control 2 and we're on the console. I can do the same thing for the terminal and for help. Having help quickly available with Control 3 is very handy, very nice to have. Plots. In the same way that I can look at plots this way, going forward and backward when I have plots available, I can do the same thing here. Look at next plots, zoom in, save these plots as images or PDFs. Now, another thing I can do is create sessions. Now, one thing that RStudio does is it runs R below it, so to speak. It is a layer above R, so that when you run something, it basically passes the information from RStudio into R and then runs that. There may be times when R is overwhelmed by the information that you give it. You may be able to give it smaller data sets, but if you find that you're lagging in large data sets of 1 million or so, you might want to interrupt it and figure out a different way to load your data. So you can interrupt, terminate the R program, or restart it altogether. Other things that you can do here are looking at the working directory or the files and folder locations that you have, and then loading workspaces. Building discusses building tools if you are going to program a package or module for later use. Debugging is similar types of tooling. Profiles we'll talk about later, and tools, as you see, are fairly straightforward. So if you want to look at the global options, this is basically the preferences for RStudio. Let's look at that quickly. So as that slowly comes up, we see that we're left with this page here, and we have a lot of information that we can play with or change as we need to. So this here is asking me for the working directory. It says right now that it's simply going to my home directory, but I could actually change that to go to Documents and change that so that all my work is now saved to the documents. I could even go to Browse again, create a folder called R Projects, and open or save that. And oh, it didn't take it, but create. Let's try that again. RStudio packages. Okay, here we go. And there we go. It's now listed there. I can now change this anytime I want. So you may want to look at some of these options. I would suggest not playing with them right now because you can sort of change the operations, and until you're sort of used to using certain things, I wouldn't change too much. The code button here, as you might see, tells RStudio how many tab places to use. So instead of using a tab, it uses spaces and promotes by two spaces per tab. You can insert matching parentheses, so you don't have to add the last one at the very end. You can auto indent code. There's all sorts of things you can do. Display. Now, the display is a nice thing to sort of look at because it might highlight selected words or show line numbers. I can actually show line numbers of my program here. Show margin or margin columns. That can be very useful because I may have a very small program that may be 40 characters in width. Most columns use 80 characters, and there are times when you might want to bump this up to 90 or 100 characters so that it squeezes more information onto your page. Show white spaces. Actually, it shows these white spaces as dots. Show indentation guides, blinking cursor, all sorts of things like that. So, saving. Saving now is regarding how you're going to save the information, how you're going to use RStudio later on. So you have several options. One is stripping trailing horizontal white spaces when saving. So that may not seem important to you now, but maybe in the future. Instead of having many white spaces after this line, for example, it will strip them or take them off and delete them so that you're not ending your line after 15 spaces, for example. Completion. Completion is very nice. Just like Linux has tab completion, R has completion as well. So you can actually have it do manually or automatically when you finish a number of letters or a parenthesis or something like that. How many completion delays? Well, Right now it is set to the third letter. So once you type in 3 letters, it will make a suggestion. It will make that suggestion rather slowly. It will occur after about a quarter of a second. Diagnostics. So when you're running your program, you might find that error messages are important for you to look at and investigate to find out what's wrong with your program. These diagnostics might be helpful so that it tells you more information about what was wrong with your program. These are good to sort of look at and keep track of. Appearance, you can change how it looks in any way you want. And we'll go back to monospace. Pane layout, if you wanted to, you could actually change the placement of these 4 windows. We won't. Packages. Packages basically tells RStudio where to look for and where to find different packages, how to obtain those packages over secure HTTP or not, and what to do when you download some of these packages. Do you use certain tools or libraries that may be helper libraries? RMarkdown. RMarkdown is something that we'll get into in a moment, but it's a nice sort of feature that RStudio gives you. It's a very nice way of adding simple changes to your document using small little tools such as hash marks and asterisks and dashes to indicate bullet points and indicate numbering and so forth. Sweeve. Sweeve, or what I like to use is knitr, Knitr, is something that we'll talk about in a moment, but it actually allows you to publish your work on the internet. This will be very useful to you. Spelling, if you have a dictionary, if you have Word or some other document on your computer, you can actually add a dictionary so it can check and spell check your work. R also has the ability to communicate with Git or other types of software version control methods. Publishing, as I mentioned here, you can publish to the internet, and we'll talk about that later. And of course, the terminal. What terminal do you want to use? Bash is the most common terminal that is used with Linux right now, especially with Ubuntu. So, I hope this helps, and we'll look at this much later on the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.